All right. What I want to talk about today is, or answer the question, why pruning is good. Yeah, we're going to talk about that today. We're going to talk about, or try to answer the question, why pruning is good. Because I want us to think about today, what is necessary for someone to grow spiritually. Sometimes growth can be a painful process. But even though through the pain, this action that we need to grow spiritually is necessary. Because there's a process that helps us grow spiritually and also in our natural lives, and it is called pruning. This concept we read about in the Bible when Jesus is telling his disciples that every branch that bears fruit, the Father prunes. I want us to understand that pruning is good, and we can get there, and I'll tell you why. Because if we think about this metaphor of bearing fruit from the branches, and like we talked about a couple of weeks ago, staying connected to the vine, who is Jesus, and also the Father, who is the vine dresser. In some Bible translations, it talks about him being the gardener. So in this concept of gardening, we need to be pruned, or have this process of pruning for us to produce more fruit, as Jesus talks about in John 15. So I was looking at this and looking at this concept of pruning, and I don't have a green thumb. Like, I don't know how to grow things. The best thing I could do is try to get better at cutting my grass. That's probably the best thing that I can do. But I had to go and ask my wife, because she has plants in our home. And I asked her, I said, what is this pruning thing? Like, what do you do when you go? Because I would see her go and cut off little leaves of the plants, or cut off a piece of the plant about every couple of months or every 6 weeks. And I asked her, I said, what is going on with this? And she says that every time she sees like a brownish strand or a leaf or something that's looking like it's dead, she cuts it off. And she explained this to me. She said, if I don't cut it off, the dead parts can affect the rest of the leaves, or even the whole life of the plant. I want us to start to think about that in a spiritual sense, in a way, in our lives. She said it can affect the leaves, or either it can affect the whole life of the plant if she doesn't prune this. And I thought about this for a moment. So, I had to get on Google, and I started researching and look at some articles and read about this, and I found some things about pruning too. It said that, and like I said, I want us to think about this within the context of spiritual growth in our spiritual lives. It says if you don't prune a plant, it can invite unnecessary pests into it. I have another one I found. It says if you don't prune a plant, it can invite disease, which can reduce fruit that can grow. Think about this in the context of what we're talking about. If you don't prune a plant, it can create weak, unsafe branches which can compromise the structure. I want us to think about that. And like I said, in the way of my mind works, man, I think this is beautiful about how we're about to talk about how pruning is good and what God is trying to get us to do, right? Because if we think about these things, and if in the context of John 15, if the Father doesn't prune us, then it can invite unnecessary things in our lives, which is sin, right? But in the context of the gardening and the plant, it says you can invite a pest. So I looked up the definition of pest, and a pest is any living thing that harms people, damages food, a cause or causes an annoyance. I want us to think about that and how those three things can happen if the Lord doesn't prune us, right? So if the Lord doesn't prune that anger out of us that we may have, we can invite unnecessary things in our lives. We can invite sin. We can stay with the metaphor as far as pest. We can invite damaging things like a pest into our lives. If the Lord doesn't prune the revenge out of our heart, right? It can invite pests or unnecessary things. If the Lord doesn't prune us from idol worship or even the worship of self, it can invite unnecessary things in our lives or unnecessary pests in our lives. But if the Lord doesn't prune us, these pests or even sin can damage our ability to receive spiritual fruit. And we can become so annoyed that we get distracted from what the Lord has called us to do. So like I said before, pruning is good, because when I think about this in the garden sense, Jesus talks about bearing fruit, right? So if you're a gardener, you're trying to get rid of the pest so it doesn't damage the fruit, right? So if Jesus talks about this in John 15, which I encourage you to read like we talked about 2 weeks ago, like bearing fruit, we're going to talk about that, is one of the things that helps us in our walk with Christ, right? Because like I said, if you're a gardener, you want to get rid of the pest so it doesn't damage the fruit. And let's go ahead and say it. A pest could be pornography. Like I said, it's sin. Pest could be bad girlfriend, bad boyfriend, bad wife, or bad husband. A pest could be drunkenness. A pest could be greed, right? The Lord wants to prune us from these things so we can get closer to Him. Because like Jesus talked about, like we talked about 2 weeks ago, if we stay connected to the vine, then we're able to bear fruit, right? So pruning is also connected with cleansing. Some people may say it could be a part of the sanctification process, bringing us more and more closer to Christ, making us more and more holy. In this concept, it is close to cleansing. So like I said, God wants us to be cleansed. God wants us to be closer to Him and not have these unnecessary things in our lives. Just the way my mind works, God is doing spiritual pest control when He's pruning us, right? Right? But like I said, it's in the concept of cleansing also. In 1 John chapter 1 and verse 9, it says that He cleanses us from all unrighteousness, right? So God is trying to get us to the place to walk in His righteousness when He is pruning us. The Lord is trying to cleanse us from doing these things because, like I talked about, we are to bear fruit. So the fruit that it talks about, we talked about this a couple of weeks ago. In Galatians chapter 5, verses 22 and 23, the fruit of the Spirit, that's what it talks about. This love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness. And in verse 23, gentleness and self-control. We cannot exhibit any of these godly characteristics truthfully if we are not pruned, right? So Jesus says that when we are pruned, we can bear fruit. But then later on in John 15, He says that we can do this and also we'll be able to bear much more fruit if we are connected to Him, right? So there is a progression of growth, or a progression of holiness, a progression of righteousness that happens. Well, that's what's supposed to happen when we are being pruned. Because pruning is to bear fruit, to get us close to God, but also it can get us out of our comfort zone. Because like when God tells us to go and pray for someone who we may know is not very nice, right? Go and pray for them. One of the fruits of the Spirit is being kind, right? So that's still bearing fruit. Like when God tells us maybe to go and help someone who we may not want to help, or maybe we're nervous about helping someone. Showing that kindness, that gentleness, right? In another sense of bearing fruit of what that looks like, even in the sense that we get ourselves in a place of temptation. And God shows us, hey, you need to have self-control, right? Because we may say that temptation is always kind of connected to sex or something like that, but it could be a temptation to fight somebody when we get mad. And God says, hey, not right now, you need to have self-control. So that's that bearing fruit. That's what that looks like. So God has us moving past our feelings to get his will accomplished. That's another part of pruning. So like God is trying to discipline us to be authentic as we can in our walk. Because we know we have people out here that are being fake. We have people out here that are producing bad fruit, right? Not being authentic. But that's what they're not taking the pruning seriously, right? So when the Lord prunes us, he's trying to make us more authentic and not to be fake Christians. Because we have to be more like Christ. But some people may want to be more like Christ, but they don't want the discipline of pruning. That's another part of pruning. God wants us to be a little more disciplined as we get closer to him. Because that's the last thing I want to talk about, this discipline, because I'll leave you with this. And it's Hebrews chapter 12. And sorry, it slipped my mind. I think it's verse 2. It's Hebrews chapter 12. And it says this, it says, no discipline is enjoyable while it's happening. It's painful, but afterward, there will be a peaceful harvest of right living for those who are trained in this way. I want us to think about that. No discipline is enjoyable. It's painful. But afterward, there will be a peaceful harvest of right living, holy living, right? For those who are trained in this way. So I hope this talk answered the question about why pruning is good. For us to bear more fruit. Later on in John chapter 15, he says to bear more fruit for the Father's glory. Right? So it's all for his glory, but also it's for us to grow more and more and more closer to Christ. So like I said, I hope we answered this question. I hope this video has blessed you. And like I said, always and again, let the Lord bless you and keep you forever. And we'll see you next time.